Moral hypocrisy is a bad thing. It's something that we ought to remove whenever we become aware of it. And what I want to argue in this video is that many Christians are hypocritical when it comes to their objections to same-sex marriage. I'm not saying that all Christians are hypocritical on that ground, but some are. And so take a look at the reasoning. I'm going to give an explanation as to why I think they're being hypocritical, and then give at the conclusion some solutions going forward. What prompts me to talk about this in the first place is that yesterday, this November 29th, 2022, the United States Senate passed a bill called the Respect for Marriage Act, which protects marriage both for interracial couples and for same-sex couples. Well, I am in an interracial marriage. My wife is Korean, so I'm certainly happy about that. And many Christians weren't happy about that, not, I suppose, because of the interracial side, but rather because of the extension of marriage rights to same-sex couples. Here's an example. This was from Albert Mohler. He tweeted this today, November 30th. He said, "No attempt by a government to dignify same-sex marriage will ultimately work. You cannot dignify what is prohibited by Scripture and contrary to creation." Now, it seems to me that the way I would interpret what Mohler is saying here is that he has two objections to the state legally giving status to same-sex married couples. Two reasons. The first reason that he objects to that is that he believes same-sex relationships are against Scripture. They're against the teaching of Scripture. And the second is that they are against the teaching of nature. So you could think here creation, as he references it, things like natural law arguments or slippery slope arguments, but essentially, ostensibly secular arguments against recognizing same-sex relationships as having legal status within the state. So he's arguing two independent grounds, Scripture and nature. And I want to argue that people like Albert Mohler, who argue on the scriptural grounds against the legal public recognition of same-sex relationships, generally are being hypocritical about it. Let me explain why. The principle, then, that I understand people like Mohler are appealing to here is that, again, the state should not grant legal status to marital institutions if those marital institutions are condemned within Scripture as immoral or illegitimate. Well, and then he understands that to same-sex relationships to meet that standard, and thus they should not be recognized by the state. But here is another marriage institution that Jesus actually speaks out specifically on, and it condemns it as illegitimate. Matthew 19, verses 8 to 9, when talking about the possibility of divorce and remarriage, Jesus says this: "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but he was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman commits adultery." Anyone who divorces their wife for any reason other than sexual immorality, in Greek the word is porneia, that person is in adultery in their remarried state. Now, as you probably know, the teaching in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you'll often find it repeated in slightly different form in the other one or more of the other synoptics, and that is the case here. So in Mark 10, Jesus addresses the same issue, and here he says in Mark 10, 11, and 12, "Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery." So Mark adds that this goes both ways, applies both to the man and to the woman. So what the teaching of Jesus is here, according to Scripture, is that marital institutions in which one of the partners committed porneia, then if they then divorce, then if they try to remarry, the partners are in adultery, or at least the person who committed porneia is in adultery if they now remarry. Well, then it follows pretty clearly on the principle that we just articulated, that I think is being assumed by Al Mohler, that if Scripture condemns a marital institution as illegitimate, then the state ought not to recognize that institution as having legal status. And so if you want to be consistent as a Christian on this issue and reason against same-sex relationships as having legal recognition based upon the teaching of Scripture, you should likewise argue that marital institutions which are remarriages after a divorce for a reason other than porneia, that those institutions are illegitimate and should not be recognized by the state. And that would require you to argue to develop legislation, to be supporting legislation and the passage of that legislation to condemn as illegitimate marriages that are the result of following a divorce and for any reason other than porneia. The state should not recognize them. And so if you fail to apply the same principle that you're using against same-sex relationships to condemn these divorced and remarried relationships, you are being inconsistent and you're being hypocritical, which, as we've already agreed upon, I think, is a bad thing. You ought not to be a moral hypocrite. This leaves that person with three different options, and with this I'm going to conclude. The first option is, in a sense, I think, to bite the bullet and to say, you're right, we ought to start defending legislation that withdraws the right to marry for people who have already been married and been divorced for a reason other than porneia. That's the option one. I don't see that happening. Now, it may happen, but I don't see that happening. It doesn't seem to me like conservative Christians who are so exercised about same-sex relationships receiving legal recognition by the secular state, I don't see that same passion for withdrawing legal recognition for people who are divorced and remarried. So I just don't think that first one's going to happen. So then there are two other options. The second option is to drop your campaign against same-sex relationships having legal recognition. If you've already abandoned this appeal to Scripture principle when it comes to divorced and remarried couples who do receive secular state legal recognition, then you should also be consistent and drop it with respect to same-sex relationships. Or there is a third option. The third option would be to drop the appeal to Scripture as your relevant ground for arguing against same-sex relationships in the beginning, in the first place. This brings me back to Al Mohler's tweet. Again, I'm just going to read it. He says, "No attempt by a government to dignify same-sex marriage will ultimately work. You cannot dignify what is prohibited by Scripture and contrary to creation." I'm going to suggest for this third option, what Mohler can choose to do is stop appealing to what is prohibited by Scripture as being a relevant criterion for arguing in the public secular square against the legal recognition of same-sex relationships. He can still appeal to contrary to creation, and he could make an argument, again, maybe a natural law argument or a slippery slope argument or something else. He could make an argument appealing to the disanalogy at some relevant point between same-sex relationships and divorced and remarried relationships. You could make that case on secular grounds, but what you can't do consistently is disregard what Jesus says in Matthew 19 and Mark 10 about divorce and remarriage, and yet appeal to what Leviticus or what Paul say about same-sex relationships as you interpret the Bible, and use that as a sort of cudgel to force a particular understanding, religiously grounded understanding of marriage upon the secular state.